One of the things that comes closest to a method of meditation that I explain here on this channel quite often is a kind of do nothing meditation that people often think of as basically the same or identical to the method of no method or well other literal do nothing meditations of contemporary traditions or at least contemporary times. While there are similarities, it could not be further from the truth. Today, we hopefully shed some light on the non-activity kind of meditation that many here like to do a lot. Well, the first thing that comes to mind when it comes to the wrong style of do nothing or non-activity meditation would be literally doing nothing at all. I mean, you can do that. You can, for example, sit yourself or seat yourself in front of a wall, stare at the wall, and literally try to do nothing at all, which would at least be partially right, but there's also a big potential for error there. In the end, we do not want to eliminate all kind of activity from our lives or from our practice. What we aim at is try to remove the unwholesome kinds of activities. It is just that this kind of practice can help reveal those unwholesome impulses that we then can understand and in turn stop. And this is more or less the idea behind it. We don't want to do nothing at all, because that too would be a manipulation of circumstances, and that is not something that we are trying to aim at. We want to overcome action altogether, and doing nothing at all is also a kind of action. And then we have the method of no method, which is another, I would say, wrong example that this kind of non-activity practice gets equated with, where people try to sit back, so to speak, and allow things to naturally unfold. But in turn, they also overshoot or undershoot the mark by not putting emphasis on the wholesomeness or unwholesomeness of the actions and intentions that are going on right now. In the end, again, you want to eliminate the unwholesome kinds of actions and cultivate the wholesome kinds of actions. If you just allow everything to naturally unfold, even if it seems to happen on its own, you are still not doing the work that the Buddha described. You specifically want to remove the unwholesome kind of actions. And this is kind of the problem. This is the entire difficulty of the practice in a nutshell. You want to learn and understand what wholesome and unwholesome even are. You want to understand, before that, preferably, what craving and non-craving are. You want to understand the motivation behind your actions, or the motivation that accompanies your action. You want to learn why you do something, and that requires a bit of detachment, a bit of yoniso manasikara, a bit of womb attention. And in the end, activity requires intention. Activity, overall, requires craving. It requires an individual. And this is very important. You cannot have action without someone performing the action, so to speak, or it's no longer fit to be called an action. I mean, the Arahant, in the end, as an example, someone who has truly laid down the burden of karma, the burden of action, is still doing things with the body, but he's not doing them, so to speak. And initially, we literally have no access to this special kind of neutral karma, the actions that lead to non-action in the future. So we kind of have to be smart about it and really understand what we have to do to end up at this place. And just trying to imitate people who have reached that spot in their practice will not do it, because it's literally impossible without the understanding. And for example, from the Anguttara Nikaya number 8.12, the general Siha went to the Niganta Nataputta, and he said to him, "Bhante, I wish to see the ascetic Gautama." And he responded, "I have heard this, Bhante. The ascetic Gautama is a proponent of non-doing, who teaches his Dhamma for the sake of non-doing, and thereby guides his disciples. To those who speak thus, state what has been said by the Blessed One, and not misrepresent him with what is contrary to fact. Do they explain in accordance with the Dhamma, so that they would not incur any reason for criticism or ground for censure. For we do not want to misrepresent the Blessed One." So after questioning the Niganta Nataputta several times, he went to the Buddha nonetheless and questioned him several times. And the Buddha answered, "There is, Ziha, a way in which one could rightly say of me, the ascetic Gautama is a proponent of non-doing, who teaches his Dhamma for the sake of non-doing, and thereby guides his disciples." And the same fragment of conversation has been repeated for deeds, that he claimed that the Buddha is an annihilationist, that he teaches the Dhamma for repulsion, for abolition, for torment, for retiring, and for consolation. And in the end, the Buddha always answered in the same way. And in what way, Siha, could one rightly say of me, the ascetic Gautama, is a proponent of non-doing, who teaches his Dhamma for the sake of non-doing and thereby guides his disciples? For I assert the non-doing of bodily, verbal, and mental misconduct. I assert the non-doing of the numerous kinds of bad, unwholesome deeds. It is in this way that one could rightly say of me, the ascetic Gautama is a proponent of non-doing who teaches his Dhamma for the sake of non-doing and thereby guides his disciples. And the gist of the sutta should be very clear by now. In the end, it is all about the understanding of wholesome and unwholesome. What you try to avoid is doing the various kinds of unwholesome deeds of body, speech, and mind, in that order. You want to start with the bodily actions because they are most visible. You cannot hide any kind of unwholesome bodily action from yourself if you are honest with yourself. It is literally impossible because your body is doing those actions for you in clear eyesight, and you cannot overlook it unless you purposefully look away. And the same, to a lesser extent, I would say, also applies to the verbal actions. You can hear them. Your body is speaking for you, and you can hear that speaking. It is about the non-doing of the right kinds of things. It is about the non-doing of the unwholesomeness. It's about non-doing of craving-motivated actions by body, speech, and mind. And again, you can think about it as a dirty, you can compare your mind with a very dirty piece of cloth. Your bodily actions are very big stains, your verbal actions are mid-sized stains, and your mental actions are small stains on that otherwise white piece of cloth. As you can imagine, you will not even see the small and mid-sized stains if it is full of very big stains that are blocking the view of everything inside. Sure, you can see some things, no question about it, but the vast majority of verbal actions and verbal motivations, as well as mental motivations, is hidden from you. You cannot see them. And as such, you have to first train yourself in the domain of the body, then in the domain of the speech, and then the mental domain fully becomes accessible to you. And this is where we want to aim at. And in another sutta, the Buddha explained it as follows. Rahula, when you wish to do an action with the body, you should reflect upon that same bodily action thus. Would this action that I wish to do with the body lead to my own affliction, or to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both? Is it an unwholesome bodily action with painful consequences, with painful results? When you reflect, if you know this action that I wish to do with the body would lead to my own affliction, or to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both, it is an unwholesome bodily action with painful consequences, with painful results, then you definitely should not do such an action with the body. But when you reflect, if you know the action that I wish to do with this body would not lead to my own affliction, or to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both, it is a wholesome bodily action with pleasant consequences, with pleasant results, then you may do such an action with the body. And this is from Majjhima Nikaya number 61. And it's a very important sutta that displays the heart of the practice of virtue. And the Buddha also repeats the same statement for verbal actions and for mental actions. And he repeats each of those statements before you perform an action, while you perform an action, and after you perform an action. So this is very important. This is the instruction for his son to pretty much reach arahantship. And as such, you should keep in mind that it's very important. The purification of bodily actions and speech is what would be considered virtue, because other people can see it, and you are considered to be virtuous when you behave by body and speech in a way that is fit to be the behavior of a holy person. And then there's the samadhi part of the practice that concerns itself with only the parts that you can see, the samadhi part, the mental actions. And this is what we too try to aim at. And this practice obviously requires very good knowledge of wholesome and unwholesome, because you cannot decide if an action will lead to the suffering of yourself, others, or both, unless you have a rather good idea of what wholesome or unwholesome even mean. Because in the end, wholesome and unwholesome mean leading to liberation or leading away from liberation. And this is very important. And it requires quite good familiarity with the phenomenon of craving and feeling, because craving can be severely misunderstood nowadays. People usually only understand craving to be a momentary thing, something that is sometimes there and sometimes not, while in reality our experience is pretty much affected by craving non-stop. And this leads to a lot of blind spots and wrong views about the practice. Because if you interpret craving to just be a momentary pressure or pull in this or that direction, then you miss the entire domain of craving that is more playing out on the level of views, which is the important part of the practice. Because what we in the end want to change is our view to become the right view, which is the breakthrough to the Dhamma. So how to do nothing at all while things are still happening? How to cross the flood? How to move from this shore to the other shore, from the near shore to the far shore, as the suttas say, and the Buddha answered that, by neither going forwards, nor going backwards, nor standing still. And this can seem like a very confusing statement, but it is true. Initially, the mind is simply affected by craving. And based on all the precepts and the rules for monks and nuns, as an example, and by many other of the early practices, you try to purify your experience, your entire life, sufficiently so that you can actually see the more and more subtle levels. And after that, you can try and sit for a while, attempting to do nothing at all, simply to reveal other parts of the craving aspects of your experience that are otherwise invisible. So by doing nothing, you actually try to reveal the things that you are still doing. You want to reveal the unwholesome kinds of actions that are still going on. And it's impossible to do unless your bodily and verbal behavior have been purified beforehand. And not all of the actions that the body performs, by the way, are craving-based, are motivated by craving. For example, when you scratch yourself or something like that. And for an advanced practitioner, even when you speak, it is not necessarily motivated by craving. When you move around, it's not necessarily motivated by craving. For a Pudujana, or a worldling, for one of the many, so to speak, it is always motivated by craving. There's always craving in the experience. Not necessarily sensual craving, but there is always craving. But as you can imagine, you can do nothing while the body is still performing actions or while the mouth is still speaking. And many of those actions are doing themselves, and those are perfectly fine. Trying to prevent those is a meaningless endeavor. It is even leading you away from liberation, because those actions have never been the problem, but stopping them, exerting a degree of control over them, that is a problem, and I would advise against it. Craving is always related to doing. Karma means action. You're always doing something, and that doing is always on you. You are fueling that doing. And more of the actual nothing, the more you have practice, will become available. So you can actually start doing nothing and have revealed more and more things. And at some point, you truly are doing nothing. You can just sit down and are perfectly still in body, still in speech, and even still in mind. And then your mind will enter a state of samadhi. And do not try to skip ahead. Many of the modern jhana practices, as an example, are just ingraining another sense of control that you use to get to your jhana. You are not relinquishing control. You are not renouncing control. Quite the opposite. You are purposefully cultivating a degree of control on the mental level that leads to pleasure for you. Just sit for longer and longer and see how the mind wants to trigger you into breaking your non-activity of greed, aversion, and delusion, that wants to trigger you into becoming active again. And then stop all those unwholesome kinds. Really reflect. And again, this Rahula Sutta, while it can seem quite early in the practice, it's a very, very advanced practice, totally before the breakthrough to the Dhamma, I would say. At least if the definition of wholesome and unwholesome used in that sutta is all-encompassing. Because the understanding of wholesome and unwholesome, in the end, in a nutshell, is the understanding that a Sotapanna has attained. The spotless, blind spotless understanding. And this is how you truly escape action and karma. Doing nothing at all won't work. Doing only certain kinds of things, like pleasure things or pain things, won't work. Doing the right kind of things can work, if you do it rightly. And this is what we try to aim at. But anyway, let us now come to the most important points of today's video. So, first, truly doing nothing at all is hard. It's a very challenging practice. And initially, we have no access to the neutral kind of action that leads to the extinguishment of all action until we have attained the right view. From then on, we can start cultivating it in a targeted manner. But actually doing nothing is the least worst or least wrong kind of practice in the beginning. This is why I'm very vocal about it. It's very difficult to do nothing at all, and it's very difficult to do it out of craving. So when your mind suggests to you to leash out at other people or something like that, then actually doing nothing is usually a very good thing to do. At least it's not very wrong. But in the end, it is all about the removal, the non-doing of greed, aversion, and delusion. It is a gradual cultivation of knowing what unwholesome and wholesome even are. You want to see and understand your intentions, and then stop the wrong ones. And this is quite the advanced practice. Again, do not get frustrated if things won't go the right way immediately. It's a very gradual, and for some people, or many people even, a very slow training that is sometimes painful, sometimes very enjoyable, sometimes quick, and sometimes slow. But anyway, this should be enough for today. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoy what I do, feel free to like, subscribe, and maybe even join the Dhamma Discord server. But until then, I wish you a pleasant day and goodbye.